So we're going over the little bit of chapter 21 that we didn't go over, and then all of chapter 22 and chapter 23. So this section tells of the time that Paul was in custody in Jerusalem. So last week he came to Jerusalem and he got arrested, and there was an uproar in the city. We read that in chapter 21, and that uproar is going to and is turning into a conspiracy to have Paul killed. We're going to read about that in this chapter. And we actually read in the last chapter in chapter 21 and verse 31, it says that they were seeking to kill him. That's before the tribune came and arrested him. So there's going to be this conspiracy to try to kill Paul. We'll read that in this section. And this section ends with Paul getting moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea just because it wasn't safe for him to be there because of this conspiracy that we'll read about. And so he gets moved to Caesarea, and eventually he'll get moved to Rome. And that's kind of the end goal for Paul, is to get to Rome. And all of these things that are happening is orchestrating for that to happen. So these are the headings in your notes. I didn't include this in the notes like I usually do just because I needed the room. It's kind of redundant anyway, so we'll look first at this little speech that Paul gives to the people there in Jerusalem. Then he gets taken back into custody, and there's a cool thing that happens. Then he's going to go before the Jewish council, and there's going to be a fight that happens. It's kind of comical. Then there's the plot or the conspiracy to have him killed, and then we end with him going to Caesarea. Any comments or questions on anything? I better make sure my mic is on. Yeah, it's on. Okay. All right, so chapter 21, we're still in there, and what we just covered before is Paul, there's this, you could kind of call it a riot. It's more of a commotion kind of a thing. I don't think it uses the word riot like it did in Ephesus, but there's a lot of commotion going on, and so Paul ends up getting arrested, and the tribune, he's like the head official, I guess, from Rome in Jerusalem, and so he takes Paul back, and before he's brought into the barracks, which would be like the inner part of the prison, Paul asks him if he can speak to the crowd. And so you might remember when he was in Ephesus before, there was the riot there, and he wanted to talk to the crowd then, but the disciples wouldn't let him. This time there's no disciples here to stop him. It's just him and this Roman tribune. And so he asked the tribune, hey, I want to speak to the people. And the tribune is surprised. He asks him in verse 37, do you know Greek? Which I guess means that Paul addressed him in Greek. And then he says, are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? And so because Paul addresses him in Greek, he just assumes that he's this other terrorist that they've been looking for. And so he still doesn't know who he is. This goes back to what we looked at last week, how they arrested him and they don't know who he is and they don't know what he's done. And they really never even get to the bottom of that until eventually he goes to Caesarea, and Felix, the governor, finally kind of asks him where he's from and all of that. And so he still doesn't know who he is. But Paul explains to him, no, I'm not the Egyptian guy. I'm just a Jew who happens to know Greek. And he explains his Jewish nationality. He's from Tarsus. And then the tribune says, okay, you can speak to the crowd. And so we won't read all of his defense. That is what the Bible calls it, is more or less a defense. He's defending himself and the things that he's been doing. So we won't read through all of it, but there's a few notable things that I want to point out. One of the things is he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, and what that probably means is he spoke to them in the language that they spoke, which at that time would have been Aramaic. Hebrew at that time was kind of more or less outdated, and it kind of had evolved into Aramaic, kind of had that Persian influence in it. And so he spoke to them in their native language, whatever it might have been, if it was Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever. And it mentions here that he addressed them in the Hebrew language, and it says in chapter 22 and verse 2 that they became more quiet because they're like, oh, this guy speaks our language. So now they're listening to him. And he mentions how he's a Jew born in Tarsus, but he was brought up in this city, being Jerusalem, and he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel. You might remember Gamaliel from Acts chapter 5. That's when the apostles are brought in before the council, and they want to hurt him, they want to throw him in prison. And Gamaliel, which if you look there in Acts 5, he's the one who kind of talks some sense into him. He says, well, if what they're doing is really from God, then there's nothing you can do to stop them. So you might as well just let them go and let this thing run its course otherwise. That's more or less what he said. And about Gamaliel, it says, this is in chapter 5 and verse 34. It says that he was a teacher of the law held in honor by all the people. So Gamaliel was a rabbi who had a really good reputation among all the people. And he's the one who trained Paul. And so this says something about Paul, that he was a student of Gamaliel. This is someone that they would have known. And so he mentions that. He also told him about how he was zealous for God. This is going back to when he was still a Pharisee. He was still a Jew. And he was zealous for God, meaning he was doing these things because of the passion that he had for God. And the things that he was doing was he was persecuting Christians at that time. And he even says at one point, he says, the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. These people here, these leaders, they know who I am and they know what I was doing. I was raising havoc against these Christians here. He was persecuting them. And, when they stoned Stephen, they laid their garments at Saul's feet, because he was still called Saul back then. It mentions also after he was killed that he oversaw his execution. And then at the beginning of chapter 9, he was going to Damascus to try to throw Christians in prison. So he's telling them all this stuff, how he was zealous for God, he's persecuting Christians, but then he tells them his conversion story. And we read that before in Acts 9, and much of what he says coincides with that. And he'll actually talk about his conversion again in a later chapter of Acts when he's testifying in Caesarea. And there's a few details about Paul's conversion that I want to just remind you of. One thing is, of course, he's on his way to Damascus to put Christians in jail. So he's still persecuting Christians. He's going to drag them from Damascus to Jerusalem and put them in prison. That's what he was going to do, and he had the authority to do that. The Jewish council had given him the authority to do that. But then there's the blinded by the light moment, and he has this encounter with Jesus. That's the moment when he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I'm Jesus who you're persecuting. And so there's that moment that happens. And he's told to go to Damascus. And there he was going to be told all that he needed to do. And he's still blind at this point, if you remember. And that's when God talks to Ananias. And Ananias goes and tells Paul to rise and to be baptized. And so he retells his conversion, and once again he points out the baptism aspect of it. That shows you that baptism is the important part in terms of the conversion. It was talked about in chapter 9. It talks about it here. And notice that it says, this is in verse 16 of chapter 22, rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. So that's how we wash away our sins, is through baptism. Then Paul tells a little bit of his early Christian ministry. There's not a lot of detail about it in Acts. We more or less know that, okay, he was in Damascus, he kind of gets run out of there, he goes to Jerusalem, he's kind of run out of there, and then he goes back home to Tarsus. But now we're going to see a little more detail about what happens. And what we read about is, so he was in Jerusalem at one point, and the Lord actually told him to leave Jerusalem. And it says here he says, this is in verse 18, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." So that's what the Lord told him, and this was way back when, before he went on the missionary journeys and all that stuff. And so he calls for him to go and get out of Jerusalem. So this is when he goes to his hometown. He goes to not Troas. He goes to Tarsus, and then eventually Barnabas gets him, and they go to Antioch, if you remember. And so the Lord called him to go out of Jerusalem. And Paul says, well, if I go back to where I came from, they're going to recognize me as the one who's persecuting these Christians. And that's exactly what happened when he first came to Jerusalem. They said, well, isn't this Saul who is, persecuting us? And that's when Barnabas came and kind of vouched for him, if you remember. And so he knew that they'd recognize him as the one who persecuted the Christians. And he even points out that he's the one who oversaw Stephen's execution, and that happened in Acts chapter 7. And so he's kind of retelling a lot of things that have already happened. And some of this is new, just because it kind of broadly went over it before. But we do know that he was there at Stephen's execution, because Luke mentions it. And then this culminates in God calling him to go to the Gentiles. So even before he went to Antioch, he knew, because the Lord told him, that he's going to eventually be sent to the Gentiles. This is in chapter 22 and verse 21. He said to me, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." And that's exactly what happened. Any questions or comments on any of that? So that was Paul's address, and he concluded with the idea of being sent to the Gentiles, and that gets the crowd stirred up again, because these are Jewish people. They don't think Gentiles should be able to be included, and so now they're upset again. And so just when they had calmed down, they're getting back going again, and they end up shouting, "He should not be allowed to live." And so you see how quickly they turn on Paul. They were listening to him. It even says that they became quiet. So they're intently listening to him. And then he mentions Gentiles, and they say, well, kill this guy. He doesn't deserve to live. And the tribune realizes that, okay, this is bad. They're going to kill him if I don't do something. So he ends up bringing Paul back into the barracks, where he was initially taking him before he wanted to talk to the crowd. And this would be, for that situation, the safest place for Paul to be would be to be in custody, so that no one could come in, no crowd could come in and kill him. But what's funny is it's still not safe, because we read that when they take him into custody, they still don't know what he's done. They don't know what they're accusing him of. And so the tribune orders that they examine him by flogging. If you don't know what flogging is, I'm going to draw a picture of it to the best of my ability. A flog would be like, you have like a rod or a stick here, and then there's all these whips that are on it. And then each of these has some kind of a piece of glass or some kind of a barb or something on it. And so that's how they would flog you, is they'd whip you with this thing. And so that's what they're going to do to Paul. They're going to examine him by flogging. And we see again, they're going to torture Paul to try to get him to confess something that he's done, or really that he hasn't done. And they still don't know who he is or what he's done. And so this just kind of shows you the blatant disregard of human rights that the Jews had back then, or that the Romans had, really, because this guy's a Roman. The Romans were master torturers. We know that because they invented the crucifixion, and that's kind of the master way of being tortured, is being crucified. And they're going to torture him to try to get him to confess to something he's done, because they must figure, well, he must have done something to get him upset. And they still don't know who he is or what he's done. And so this is just a blatant violation of human rights. This would never, ever happen today. If it did, people would be, killed for it. And what's funny it's obviously a blatant violation of human rights, and Paul realizes that. Because before they get a chance to flog him, he asks them a question. And he says, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? And so here we see he's touting his Roman citizenship again. And we saw him do that before in Philippi. Him and Silas got thrown in prison, and it was for no reason. It was because they had cast some spirit out of some little girl, and the girl's owners got upset, and so they had them put in prison. And they go to release him, and he says, well, isn't this, we're Roman citizens. How have you put us in prison without a trial or a judgment or anything? And so they kind of had to apologize for it, and now he's invoking it again. What we see is that he invokes the rights he has as a Roman citizen. We'll see him do it later in order to get to Rome, but I'll touch on that later. And he has this little exchange with the tribune. So in verse 28, the tribune said, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. So the tribune had to pay money in order to become a citizen of Rome, presumably to even be able to be a tribune. But then Paul says, well, I'm a citizen by birth. And we don't know if his mom or dad was a Roman citizen. They would have had to have been. They had laws kind of like what we have, where if you're born in America, you're automatically a citizen. Even if your parents are illegal immigrants, if you're born in America, you're a legal citizen. And so they had a similar thing. If you're born to someone who's a Roman citizen, then you're also a Roman citizen. And so he's a Roman citizen by birth. And now the tribune knows that he's in big trouble because he was fixing to do all this stuff to a Roman citizen. And so he kind of gets afraid. It says, so those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So now the tribune realizes, oh, I've messed up, I've got to make this right. And we'll see that later on. But for now, they're not going to flog him. Instead, they resort to a more peaceful option, which is to bring him before the Jewish council and to try to get to the bottom of what it is that they're accusing him of. Any comments on any of that? So the tribune calls for Paul to go before the Jewish council, and this is to get to the bottom of what they're accusing him of. They still don't know what he's done. And part of the reason why is because Paul really hasn't done anything. But they're mad at him because he's preaching the gospel to Gentiles, and they want him to be killed. And so he calls the Jewish council to come together, and they're going to testify against Paul. Or really, Paul's going to testify before them. And you might remember from before, because we read about the council in chapter 5, the council was made up of various Jewish leaders. Most of it was Pharisees and Sadducees. They made up most of the council. But there were also chief priests and elders and so on and so forth. So it's kind of how I think of it. It's kind of like in Congress, how you have Democrats and you have Republicans, and then you might have a few that are independents, and they might identify with a different party. They might be Libertarian, or they might be Tea Party, or whatever. It's kind of what this was like. And so you have Pharisees and Sadducees there, and then you have chief priests and elders and so on. And you know how in the Congress, the Speaker of the House is kind of the top-ranking person? Well, for this council, the top-ranking person is the high priest. And so the high priest is the head of this council. The high priest is the one in charge. And the reason for that is because more or less the high priest was kind of the top religious official that the Jews had. They had the most authority, the high priest did. So Paul starts giving his defense, and while he's talking, Ananias, this is a different Ananias than the one who helped Paul before. This Ananias is the high priest at the time. he orders for Paul to be struck in the mouth, which is kind of a rash thing because he's just started talking and he orders him to be hit in the mouth. So they're kind of being cruel to him. And because they're being cruel to him, Paul ends up kind of talking back at him. And what he calls him is, he says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? And so he points out the hypocrisy of what's just happened. They're accusing Paul of breaking the law, all the while he just broke the law by ordering him to be struck for no reason. And so he calls him a whitewashed wall. And what that means is he had an outward appearance that looked good, but that's all that was good about him, was just the appearance that he gave. It's similar to what Jesus said of the Pharisees and scribes when he called them whitewashed tombs. On the outside it looked all pretty, but the inside was still a tomb, so there was death in it, and it was disgusting and all that. Similar sort of a thing. And now Paul kind of has messed up because those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So it was frowned upon to speak against the high priest. And the passage he quotes is from Exodus 22 and verse 28. And so that's still really not even grounds to accuse him of anything. But he realizes, okay, I need to be respectful. He was just meeting him, right? Because he disrespected Paul, and so Paul kind of disrespected him. But now he realizes, okay, this is the high priest. I need to not do that. And what happens next, I think this is one of my favorite parts of the book of Acts, because it's just comical. What he does, and you know he's wise in doing this. This took some craftiness. He ends up pinning the council against themselves. And so part of this is the differences that they had in beliefs, kind of like how Republicans believe different things than the Democrats do and all of that. Well, the Pharisees and Sadducees had different beliefs. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't. And the reason the Sadducees didn't primarily is because they wanted to be wise like the Greeks were, like the Athenians were, and they were naturalists, and what that means is they didn't believe in supernatural things. A resurrection is a supernatural thing. That's not something that happens ordinarily. And so they didn't believe in a resurrection, they didn't believe in spirits, they didn't believe in angels, but the Pharisees believe in all these things. So this is kind of the big difference between them, and Paul uses that difference to pin them against each other. And so what Paul says, and he knows what he's doing, he says, this is in chapter 23 and verse 6. Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And so he points out the whole reason I'm even on this trial in the first place is because of the hope that I have in the resurrection. And that's actually true, because he doesn't mention it, but it's the resurrection of Jesus that he's talking about, that Jesus is raised from the dead, and the hope of the resurrection that is to come for those who are in Christ. And so he says it's the hope of the resurrection. That's the reason I'm on trial. Well, that instantly pins the Pharisees against the Sadducees, because the Pharisees say, let's see, I'll read in verse 7. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And so he pins them against each other. They start first presumably verbally fighting, and then it actually gets physical. He says, when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go and take him away from among them and bring him into the barracks. So this disagreement turns violent, and that leads to Paul having to go back to the barracks because it wouldn't be safe for him to be there. And so he kind of gets out of this appearance before the council by pinning them against each other. I just think that's really funny that he's able to do that. And he knows to do that because he was a Pharisee. And he very well might have been in that council before himself, before he became a Christian. Next, we're going to read of the plot to kill him. Any questions on anything? Comments? So he's in custody, he's in the barracks, and this is the next day, and we read of a plot that happens where there's more than 40 Jews who make this vow to neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And this has happened before. It hasn't really happened recently of notoriety besides Gandhi. I think Gandhi might be the last one to do it, to go on a hunger strike kind of thing, where you say, okay, I'm not going to eat until I get my way. And that's usually done as a way of protest. Well, this is not a protest, but a vow that they're making. And they're saying, hey, we're not going to eat or drink until we kill this guy. That's how important this is to them. It's more important than them actually surviving. And so they make this vow to not eat or drink until they killed Paul, which presumably that's a vow that they don't keep because they don't kill him. So either they starved or they broke the vow. And so they orchestrate this plan, and it mentions that they go to the chief priest to try to orchestrate this. It says, they went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we've killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you're going to determine his case more exactly, and we're ready to kill him before he comes near. So they orchestrate this plan. They bring the chief priests in with it, and the chief priests just go along with it. And the plan is to ambush Paul while he's on his way to see the council from being in custody with the tribune. And so the chief priests agree to this. And it's interesting because the chief priests are supposed to be kind of the higher religious officials that the Jews had, and yet they get wrapped up in this conspiracy. And this just shows the hypocrisy of the whole thing. They would act like they are, these really devout religious people, but they're in this conspiracy to try to kill Paul. And so the hypocrisy of it is just on full display. And this is one of the major themes of the book of Acts, because you see it throughout the book, especially when you get to Paul's journeys and things. It's just the hypocrisy of the Jews, and you saw it with Jesus too. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but here they're willing to break the law just in order to get their way, because obviously it's against the law to murder somebody, and that's what they were trying to do. And so there's this plot to kill Paul, and it's funny. Paul's nephew heard of the plan, and he reported it to Paul. We learn a little bit about Paul through this, because it says that this is the son of Paul's sister. So we learn that Paul had a sister, and we learn that Paul's sister must have been married and had a son. And the son is of age to at least understand what's going on. He's probably still a kid, but he understands what's happening. And so he goes and he reports this to Paul. And he gets wind of what's going to happen. And so Paul tells his nephew, because Paul's, in custody, he can't go anywhere. He tells him to go and to tell what he'd heard to the tribune. And so the guard takes the nephew to the tribune, and he tells the tribune about the plot to have Paul killed. And so now the plot is kind of falling apart, because the whole idea is for the tribune to not know this, and for him to bring Paul to the council, and then they're going to ambush him on the way. But now the tribune knows about it, and obviously now something needs to be done in order to prevent this from escalating. And so what ends up happening is they have to send Paul somewhere else, and it's going to be Caesarea. Any comments or questions? So the tribune organizes for Paul to be sent to Felix, the governor, who was in Caesarea. That's where the governor lived. He would kind of go, all over the place. But Felix was kind of the governor of that whole region. And so they end up taking this to a higher court. And so they're going to take him to Caesarea so that he can be Felix's problem. And we read about what all they need in order to make that happen. And so the tribune calls 2 centurions And he says, get ready 200 soldiers. They're centurions, so they're in charge each of 100 soldiers. That's why they're called centurions, from century meaning 100. And so he tells them, hey, get your soldiers, and then also get these horsemen, get 70 horsemen, and then get 200 spearmen, and go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. And so there's going to be hundreds of horsemen and soldiers and spearmen, and they're going to escort Paul to Caesarea. And this is obviously to make sure that he's not going to be harmed. Because if it's just one soldier escorting him, 40 people can take down 2 people. That's pretty simple. But when you have 40 people against 470 people, 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 horsemen, obviously that's going to be not realistic to do. And so this is to protect Paul, to make sure he doesn't get harmed. And he also points out that they're to do this at night in order to be secretive. That's presumably why they would do that. You do things at night if you don't want to be seen because it's at dark. They didn't have like street lights and stuff like that. So that's kind of like when Nicodemus went to Jesus. He did it at night so that the other Pharisees wouldn't see him doing it. So they're going to do this at night, presumably to be secretive. And it mentions that this is in the third hour of the night, which is what my version says. And then my version in the ESV, it has a little footnote, and it says that's about 9 p.m. So that's in the night. Just when it gets dark, they end up going. And so the tribune, because obviously he's got to fill in Felix on what's going on. And so he writes Felix a letter. And he's explaining the situation, but he embellishes a few things. And kind of the main thing that he embellishes is that he portrays himself as saving Paul. What had happened is, and maybe in a way he did, you could maybe try to portray it that way, but really that wasn't his intention. Because there's this uproar in Jerusalem, and to kind of quiet the uproar, he just arrests Paul, and he doesn't know who he is or what he's done. But he portrays himself as saving Paul, and he also says he saved him from being flogged, but it was him who ordered him to be flogged in the first place. And then Paul told him, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do this. And so now he's kind of trying to save himself, and he portrays himself as the good guy, as the one who saved Paul from these angry Jews. But really, he's just as guilty as the Jews were, because he arrested him and he didn't know who he was, didn't know what he'd done, and then he was going to have him flogged, still not knowing what he had done. And then he details more or less the situation, and this is mostly true, about how the Jews wanted to have him killed. And so it says, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And so then he tells him about the plot, that they're going to try to kill him, and he says, I sent him to you at once. And so he details to Felix that they're looking to have him killed, and they even had this plot to do it. And so that's why he's coming to you. And so the next day they do it. They take Paul to Caesarea. And so Caesarea is not that far, so it took a day probably. And Felix reads the letter, and he starts asking Paul some questions. So it says, when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. Roman provinces are more or less like states, like we think of it. And Paul tells him he's from Cilicia. Cilicia is the Roman province that Tarsus is in. And so Cilicia is Paul's home state, kind of like how we're from Clio or Linden or Flint, but the state we live in is Michigan. So Paul's state is Cilicia because he lived in the city of Tarsus. And so he says, I'm from Cilicia. Cilicia is part of his jurisdiction, so he's able to have this trial. And so Felix says that once your accusers get here, we're going to have this trial and we're going to get to the bottom of this. And so he said, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. That means he's going to have a trial. And so the next couple of chapters we're going to read of this trial. And what happens is first he appears before Felix. Then Felix actually ends up not being the governor anymore. And let's see. Where does it read about this? Festus takes over. Then he appears before Agrippa, who's the king, and then he's eventually going to go to Rome. So that's the section. Here's some key takeaways, things that kind of are overarching in relation to what we read. So we read last week about these warnings that Paul had about being bound in Jerusalem, and now it was happening. The Spirit had told him about it, and we read about how he told the Ephesian elders that. Then there was the prophecy. The guy tied Paul's belt around him to show what was going to happen to Paul. And the Spirit had also told some of the disciples in wherever they were at that this was going to happen to Paul. So Paul's been warned about this happening, and now it's happening and has happened. But Paul knew that this wasn't going to be the end. He wasn't afraid for his life, because the Lord told him that he was going to go to Rome. He told him that once before, and then in this section, in chapter 23 and verse 11, Jesus said, "Take courage, for as you've testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." So Paul knows he's going to end up going to Rome. So he knows that he's not going to die in Jerusalem. He's not going to die in Caesarea. He's going to go to Rome. And this sequence of events is leading up to that happening, and God is pulling the strings, orchestrating that happening. So that's one thing. And then another thing, I mentioned it already, is the hypocrisy of the Jews. That kind of takes center stage in what's happening here. So we read before how they've already had false witnesses against Paul. That's against the law. That's one of the 10 Commandments. Don't bear false witness. And so now they're trying to murder him. That's also obviously part of the 10 Commandments. And so their hypocrisy is on full display. They are whitewashed walls, like what Paul said, in the fact that they try to portray themselves as being righteous on the outside, but that's all that was there, was just the outward appearance of righteousness. Because inwardly they were, doing all these evil things. And it's worth mentioning that they had been this way with Jesus too, and that's what led to Jesus being killed. And so they're doing this to Paul just like they did it to Jesus. And eventually it's going to come to a head, and Paul's going to end up going to Rome. Next week, we'll cover chapters 24 and 25. Any questions on any of that?